I really do think that my early experiences with, communicating differently made me really want to emphasize being understood and educating and advocating to others. And I think that's a lot of what I do in the classroom, as well as in my scholarship and research.
Welcome to Season 3 of Broadcastability, a podcast by, for, and about people with disabilities.
Broadcastability is a Proud Project production based in Toronto, Canada. Visit theproudproject.ca to learn more. This podcast was recorded and produced on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to protect the resources of the Great Lakes and the surrounding areas. This podcast was also partially produced on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We also wish to acknowledge the Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, also known as North America, where we conduct our research and record this podcast.
In this episode, we meet Kathleen Bogart, a professor of psychology at Oregon State University. We discovered her work when we read an article in Psychology Today that she and one of her grad students, Emma Hills, wrote about disability employment. We were struck by the fact that many of her conclusions mirrored many of the ones which had emerged during our 5-country study when we interviewed disabled employees, entrepreneurs, and employers in Canada, the US, the UK, and France, and Belgium. And so we were really intrigued in meeting her.
Professor Bogart shares her journey into academia as well as her evolution as a disabled person. Like many people we've spoken to, she didn't immediately identify as someone with a disability, nor with the disabled community.
Well, I'm Kathleen Bogart. I'm professor of psychology at Oregon State University. What really brought me into this research space and this advocacy space and the scholarship space is my own experience growing up with a rare disability. And I often like to say that I've been interested in psychology ever since I was born, because I was born with this condition called Moebius syndrome, which is a rare type of facial paralysis. And so, going through my initial development, navigating the world and learning how to communicate my needs meant that, I interacted a bit differently. And I think that I kind of adapted quite these creative things that I wasn't even aware that I was doing at the time, right? And I was fascinated by, how other people communicated and just by, interaction in general. So that led me to study psychology as an undergraduate. I got some great mentorship during my undergrad and realized that I really did like scholarship and I liked research, so I wanted to continue and go to grad school. And my mentors suggested that I write maybe a research paper, a term paper about Moebius syndrome because I was interested in what psychology had to say. So I kind of in my head imagined that when I went to the library, I would find an armful of journal articles. This is like back when you would go physically to the library and pull things
I remember
up.
those days. Yep.
I came away literally empty-handed. I ended up with a couple of, PDFs from old microfiche, but there really hadn't been any studies done in psychology on Moebius syndrome, especially not from anything that's not from a very deficit focused.
When you say deficit focused, is that sort of as a medical model? Is that what you're saying, that these were only medical, clinical sort of descriptions? Is that
exactly? Yeah.
Right.
So, deficit focus would be, it's medical model. It's also focused on how, these individuals will differ from the norm in a negative way, in a way that is negatively valued by our society. Right. Or sometimes it was involving participants with Moebius syndrome and using them as a way to understand, just as like a tool to understand typical neurological development, rather than having an interest in understanding the experiences of people with the condition themselves to
Right.
benefit that community.
Right. So it was sort of what was typical psychological neurological development around facial recognition and communication, and what Moebius was sort of an interesting case in order which to study these other things, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like the history of, psychology looking at all sorts of, unusual and interesting cases to learn about, like the case of HM to understand memory and things like that.
Right, exactly. Okay, understood. So let me just back before we get into your work, and maybe you're not comfortable about it, but I'm intrigued. When you have a chronic illness or you have a chronic syndrome or a syndrome that's different, particularly one that affects your face, because your face is so critical. One of the things that at least I've read, and you can tell me I'm wrong, is that one of the more difficult things is when you have like a scar or you have a wine stain, how much it impacts your interactions with other people. And I was wondering whether as a child that was easy, or even as an adolescent, I guess, emerging into adulthood, whether that was more difficult or easy, or it was fun, what your perspective on all of that was.
Yeah, yeah. So facial expression and appearance is really kind of, as you say, the one of the primary ways that other people form impressions, at least at first, right? It's what people are accustomed to being like one of the more communicative parts of ourselves. In my case, it's not so, but it makes sense that most people would be accustomed to that. So yeah, it was quite challenging as a child. It was mostly challenging in that I needed to learn how to communicate my needs and wants. As an adolescent, it became more about stigma and looking different.
Right.
And communicating differently. And I think so many people who have a disability or a visible difference go through a really hard time of bullying in adolescence when people are, the developmental milestones, they're so focused on being normative and fitting in and stuff like that.
Absolutely. They are really normative. It's the reason why I ask is because we do research on employment, and the transition from school to employment is one that's really difficult, because often in school there's sort of required a regulatory sort of parameters around which someone has been they've been part of and they get used to, and then they go out into the young world of young adulthood and then try to get jobs and then encounter difficulty there. Some of them don't, but seems to me marked in when we did this large study that that was a very important period for people, right? How they transition through that. Yeah. Anyway, I can imagine that. I mean, I ended up in the academy largely because it seemed the most accessible to me as someone with a disability. I don't know whether that was the case for you, whether you contemplated other professions or you just were really attracted immediately. It was your nature to like research and the academy.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you asked me at the time, that I would have said it was my nature that I really liked research. But I also think looking back, there may have been some aspects of my disability that led me to like that sort of thing. And I really do think that my early experiences with, communicating differently, made me really want to emphasize being understood and educating and advocating to others. And I think that's a lot of what I do in the classroom, as well as in my scholarship and research.
So you describe as you went off to the library, you came back empty-handed, and what you did find, you must have wanted to take a hammer to. Sort of go ahead from there. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, it really left me in this kind of like at this crossroads. So, the message that I got from that literature was, okay, well, psychology is not interested in experiences of people with your condition. So I could either take that information and say, okay, psychology is not the field for me, Or I could take that information and say, I'm going to make it the field for me. I'm going to make psychology care about this stuff. Talking with my mentors, I did decide to go that route. And it was a hard route, especially at first. Psychology is very much, when you're applying to grad schools, focused on, you finding a fit with a mentor who has expertise in exactly the area of work that you want to study. Well, we just established there's no one like that in the field, right? So it was really hard to find people who had interest and motivation to do this kind of work and were confident that they could work with me even if they didn't have that expertise in the specific area of facial paralysis. But luckily, eventually I did. I would describe those people as just like really open-minded and creative. They said, I don't specialize in facial paralysis, didn't really know much about it until you came along, but I know about, things like disability or facial expression, and I'm willing to learn along with you. So that's kind of where we went from there.
So had disability studies, because I'm a political scientist, and it really, until very recently, had not penetrated their understanding of social justice to any degree. I'm wondering, was psychology different? Was there an awareness of critical disability studies, or how did those two intersect for you?
There were really small, tiny pockets of awareness back when I was starting up. It really hadn't been well integrated. Now, you mentioned social justice, and I think psychology would have said, and still does, that it has a strong focus on social justice. However, my chosen field of social psychology also has a rich history of studying prejudice and discrimination. And so that aligns with social justice. In my opinion, it absolutely aligns with the experiences of people with disabilities, although the field has not historically seen it as such. So, maybe it's like, we're going to study prejudice and discrimination, and we're going to focus on, certain key groups like race and gender and sexuality. But until quite recently, disability was, kind of an afterthought.
I'd say much the same. Can you tell, for people who don't know, tell us a little bit more, what is social psychology?
Yeah, so social psychology is really the study of, let me go back to my definition that I tell my students at the start of the term. It's the study of the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors around social situations. And so what I remind my students is that's really broad. We're always doing social psychology, even when we're alone, right? Because I like to say I am often doing my best social psychology when I'm alone in bed at night thinking about that weird thing I said 9 years ago.
Exactly.
So we are constantly thinking about our interactions and about others, even when we're alone. It kind of pervades everything. Some common topics that are studied in social psychology are things like political psychology, prejudice, intergroup relations, relationships, and things like that.
Fascinating. I mean, it's interesting when you say that. There are times where I will think of something exactly like I said a decade ago, even more than that, and I'll find myself blushing, with heat, and I'm just like, wow, that's amazing. Like, how can I have a physical response still to something that is just a memory or a recollection, but you still do? And it's around social interaction. So outline your course of study. I'd love for you to share it.
Yeah, kind of the work I did in grad school really was focused on building up the literature on Moebius syndrome and then facial paralysis in general. And so you can kind of track my research program over the years by kind of watching me expand my community of interest more broadly into these concentric circles. So I started with Moebius syndrome, and I felt it was really important to have, some literature base in that area, so that the next generation of people like me, who were interested in learning about, the psychology of Moebius would have somewhere to go. But then as I started connecting with communities, I started going to Moebius Syndrome Foundation conferences, met hundreds of people with Moebius syndrome, even though I was told that because of the rarity of my condition, I would never meet someone in my life. So that was really special. And spending all that time with the community really helped me to see the, shared common experiences, strengths, and struggles that people have. And I also started to recognize that there are these other people coming into our communities, like people with different types of facial paralysis. And then I started to kind of broaden still to rare disorders as a whole, and started to attend conferences and groups for people with all sorts of rare disorders. As you well know, there's more than 7,000 different rare disorders,
Right.
and they all come with their own unique, medical manifestations. But there are a lot of commonalities at the psychosocial level. So I've been really interested in studying those.
Is that what got you interested? Were the commonalities shared across the various
Yeah.
rare disorders? And what did you find?
Yeah, I saw the same stuff I was seeing in the Moebius syndrome community. So I saw stigma, I saw isolation, I saw challenges around, diagnostic odyssey. So this, average 7 to 9 year journey to get a diagnosis.
Right.
But I also saw, a lot of cool things like the benefits of connecting with a community of people like you, and how that supports identity, how that supports companionship support. And, that's kind of led me to some more recent interests like disability identity, disability pride, and things like that.
So one of the things I'm really fascinated, I was actually reading, so I've been thinking about disability for a long time. I don't like the word, I have to say. I don't like the dis of disability. I find it, I stumble on it a bit, but that's what we have. There's the French, when we were doing a study there, I really liked they have personne en situation de handicap, which is a person in a disabling context, which I kind of liked a bit better. It's a handful to say, it's a mouthful to say. But disability identity. So one of the things, I was actually reading an article recently, actually to my family, I've forgotten what journal it was in. He was talking about that, young adults were sort of, these are 18-year-olds, 18 to 25-year-olds were saying that 18% of them, this was, I think it was in England, identified as disabled. And there's another study that the CDC did in 2018, but they published in 2019 that 18 to 35-year-olds, 52% of them identified as having a chronic illness of some sort. Now, you could say, okay, that's just depression. It could be just depression or anxiety. I mean, these are not just, but that they're not things that necessarily another generation would have identified with, that maybe this is over medicalization. So, and even as you were talking about, I had a really long journey to diagnosis. And that diagnosis is really important at some level because it helped it finally to get some control over some of my symptoms. So this walk between medicalized naming of things, and which is actually you can't get rid of and is some level important, but also disability identity, and it seems to me that it's an expanding category. I don't know what you're finding.
Yeah, there's a lot there, a lot to balance, right? So we also see that, like, according to the American CDC, that like 26% of adults in America have some sort of disability. So it's a really, more than a quarter. It's a large chunk. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think most of this is a good thing. And let me say why. So what we're talking about here is disability self-categorization, which is different from disability identity. So these are people who are saying, I have a disability. This condition that I have is a disability. And under, many civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, recognizing that your condition is considered a disability is a gateway to recognizing your rights, right? So understanding that you can't be discriminated against in a job setting, understanding that you are able to request reasonable accommodations and things like that. So I think in many ways it's a good thing that people are recognizing that certain conditions are considered disabilities, especially in countries that provide those sorts of rights. I also think that there is a good thing about understanding that disability is broader than people think, because still people have a prototype of what disability looks like, right? And within that statement I just said is the implication that disability is always visible. But in fact, most disabilities are invisible. And so we tend to assume that there are less people around us with disabilities than they are just because we can't see them. So it's actually, I think it can be really helpful for the kind of collective cause for more people to self-categorize as disabled, because it helps us recognize that it is a large and impactful group. It's a group that, for example, has collective voting power, collective advocacy power. Now, I said I feel that there's a distinction between disability self-categorization and disability identity.
Tell us about that. Yeah, tell us about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can say, someone could say, I have depression, and depression is a disability. Okay, so that person may say, I have a disability, but that person may be less likely to say, I am a disabled person. So disability identity means that a person sees their disability as more central to their identity than the words that I just used kind of distance the person from the disability, right? Rather than saying I'm a person with a disability or I'm a disabled person, which is bringing the disability closer to one's own identity.
Yeah, and I think like if we think about mental health in particular, I think broader society understands it not necessarily as a disability, especially in more frequently, or pardon me, like more recently, when does mental health is being more accepted and therefore more people are identifying as having mental illness. It's like, oh, well, that's just normal. Welcome to personhood. It's not a disability because we can't have the whole population be disabled, quote
No,
unquote.
you're right. It's interesting what you say, Lark. And one of the things we've run into, I've just tried to get an article into disability in society, and we've now rewritten it. We've run the second revision, and they're a British disability magazine. Journal, not magazine. But they were appalled that we would use a person with disability. It's got to be a disabled person, because that is an act in which you have someone is impacted negatively. There is the disability is in a sense contextual, right? And it is. Disability is deeply contextual, and that person with a disability doesn't capture that essence. And so they felt that they asked us to remove whenever we use that. And I usually put a mark at the beginning of a paper. Look, I'm going to use various terms just for ease of like speaking it and thinking. It's just, so it's not constant and boring, the same term used over and over again, but they were adamant. So it's interesting that for UK disabled advocates, they need to feel they want this disabled person because that captures the political sort of oppressive nature or the constraining nature that happens from outside. And what you're sort of saying is similar, that people will say, I have a disability, but they may not want, in fact, capture the identity that means that they are then part of a group that is somehow being excluded. If that does that make sense? Is that what you're saying, or am I wrong
It
there?
is, it is, yeah, right. This is part of the wider like conversation around person first versus identity first language, and as you say, the UK has really moved to identity first language, and I think in North America, it's when I was coming up in school, I was told you always have to use person first language. You always have to say person with a disability, and more recently, like for example, a big movement was when some colleagues of mine wrote to the American Psychological Association and said, hey, there's some really good reasons to use identity first language, and here they are. Maybe you should change your guidelines. So they did change their guidelines a few years ago to allow for either or switching. And so kind of like you, I switch a lot. I switch because it, kind of linguistically makes sense. And I also switch because I want to acknowledge that there are multiple ways that people might want to identify.
Right. I mean, we're getting into a place that, I mean, I want to ask you these questions because one of the things I've been trying to think about is how do we maybe have a new understanding of disability that we can sort of move it along. And I am probably not the best person, but I've got friends who totally oppose this, but I've been thinking about the contextualization of disability. So if you wore glasses in 1200, well, you didn't wear glasses in 1200 because simply it was not possible. And you would have been quite impaired as a result of that lack of technology. And so as you take yours off, exactly. So
so thankful for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I've been thinking about, and even as Lark was talking about, being alive means that you have mental health. There are things that are going on at some level. So part of me thinks of that we have traits, and some of them are more severe than others and require more technology or accommodation depending or just adjusting than others, and some don't. And I would love to think about traits. And again, when I even used the word traits in our paper, I was asked to remove it by Disability in Society, so we did. And I know a number of people who object to it, but I've just been thinking, is there a better way of understanding who we are as humans? Because one of the things that I feel is a benefit of disability is people with disabilities are enormously adaptive. And as you started this conversation, and maybe we can get to that, is talking about how adaptive you had been without even realizing it in terms of how you communicated, how you did things, because in essence, you were problem solving all the time. You were thinking on your feet and moving. And I think that often people with disabilities, have a remarkable ability to adjust. But they also reflect, I think, an unique, innate human capacity to do that all the time, that we do that as humans. We adjust constantly to circumstances, and disability in a sense is sort of a glorious example of how we do that. I don't know how you think about anything I've just said, but I'd love to hear your views because I think you're more learned in this than I am.
Well, I definitely agree with you about the kind of innate adaptiveness and adaptive capacity of humans. And I think disability is really one of those situations that showcases it. And I think disability can often, enhance creativity. And, I also kind of do this line of research that looks at the timing of when someone acquired their disability. And so some of my work focuses on that contrast between congenital or something you're born with and something you acquire later. And this kind of circles back to what you were talking about around adaptation and kind of the timing of it. So I had this idea that people who were born with their conditions, especially if we're talking about a stable condition, so facial paralysis is typically a stable condition. The level of paralysis I was born with is not going to change. So I went through my initial adaptation with my condition. I needed to figure out how to have my needs met. I needed to communicate when I was hungry, when I was sick, etc. Right? And so those are all things that any newborn will do with the infrastructure that they have, with the bodily, abilities that they have, right?
Yep.
And so I did it with mine. So it was, a natural feeling process. And so I was interested in, first of all, whether other people with facial paralysis also kind of adapted to communicate in other ways. And by other ways, I mean, maybe if your face isn't particularly expressive, maybe you're more expressive with your voice, with prosody, with your gestures and body language and things like that. So I did some research on people with a variety of types of facial paralysis, those with congenital and those with acquired, and interviewed them, and actually then we coded their nonverbal and verbal expression from videos. And we did find that those with congenital conditions used more of this adaptive communication. We call it alternative communication.
What is it when you say what is it? Give us some examples, because I can maybe see it as even as you're talking to me, but other people can't. Like to me, it seems you use your hands, you're moving your body, you're nodding. Like there's things, but is that what you mean? Those types of things?
Exactly. Yeah. So all of those things that you can pick up from what we call other communication channels besides the face. So we've got gestures with our arms. We've got body language. So that could include like your posture and where you're leaning, right? Like if I'm really excited about something, I'm going to lean in. And it's going to include like the tone of your voice as well, and actually what you say, right? So we actually found that people with congenital paralysis used more emotion words than those with acquired paralysis, suggesting that, if they weren't sure their emotions were being conveyed non-verbally, they just said how they were feeling verbally, right?
That's fascinating. So tell us more. So the study you did about acquired versus congenital with regard to facial paralysis. Did you learn other things around this, around the timing of when you actually get an impairment, or yeah?
Yeah, well, this was actually kind of inspired by that first step out of the concentric circle that I talked about, going from Moebius syndrome to facial paralysis in my research. And I can tell you a little story about how that happened. I did my master's in San Francisco, and then I moved to Boston to do my PhD. And Boston is, in like America, like the place you go for the highest quality and most specialized medical care. And so it was the first and probably only time in my life I will be in a place where there was a local facial paralysis support group. And I was like, this is really cool.
Yeah.
I've been to Moebius syndrome conferences where I had to travel, across the country, and everyone else did the same when we were together. But I could go in my own town once a month and see people. So, I'm really excited. I show up for my first group, and I noticed that everyone else has acquired paralysis except me. I'm the only person with congenital paralysis. And statistically, that makes a lot of sense. There are many more ways to acquire paralysis at some point down the line, especially from things like Bell's palsy or Ramsay-Hunt syndrome. So, I'm like, no matter, we all look the same to an untrained eye. We've all got facial paralysis. But I found the conversation very interesting at first. We went out in the room and introduced ourselves, and everyone else had an origin story to their condition, right? So everyone else had, this is the day it happened. This is, the confusion that we went through, the pain, and, this is how my life has changed. And I didn't have an origin story, right? It's impossible for me to, separate my condition from my identity.
Right.
So, that really got me thinking. And there are lots of examples of this, but one particular story that someone said, she had recently acquired facial paralysis, and she said, sometimes it's the little things that really get you. She said her favorite thing to do on Saturday mornings was to enjoy breakfast and a coffee over the paper. And she said, well, I can't do that now because when I'm reading the paper, I'm dropping food out of my mouth onto the paper, it's spilling coffee, it's a mess. And, I thought about it for a second, and I was like, oh, I don't have that problem. I wonder why. And then I thought a little bit more, and I realized, I do love to read. I also love to eat. They happen together sometimes. But usually what I do is I'm propping up the reading material. So when I'm eating, my gravity is not pulling food out of my mouth. And that's not something that I ever consciously thought of, that must have been one of those seamless adaptations that I developed.
No, it does seem like that. Yeah, keep going. Yeah.
So many examples of that, and that's really what kind of, supercharged that line of research, looking at adaptation and how it might differ across time.
So do you think that, obviously there's trauma associated with, when you acquire a disability, there is this trauma, and there is a belief, there's the number of times we've seen movies, read scripts, read books. So, if I can't walk, then, don't keep me alive, or, if whatever these sort of dramatic poses are, if this happens to me, I don't want it. And part of me actually, as I've worked as a bioethicist and in hospitals, and one of the things that I struggle with is that we project, there are things that happen to us that we imagine we can't cope with, and that we imagine we cannot have a good life with, when we're feel totally whole and normalized. And then we encounter those things and discover, oh, no, actually, no, I can live with this. And in fact, I can have a very meaningful and good life. So as a psychologist, when you were looking at the differences between an acquired and congenital, were there other things that you discovered about people around this, or not, or a sense of stigma? One of the comments we got from in France, I remember an employer saying, because they have a quota law, and he said one of the problems they had was that people wouldn't identify. You could have had an amputee working in your office, but if they didn't officially identify, they didn't count, right? And so,
right.
And they didn't identify because of stigma, right? They did not want the stigma. So I'm intrigued by that. Did you find any of those types of things going on?
Yeah, well, we definitely, continued this line of work. We moved from facial paralysis specifically to looking at other types of disabilities. And the next project I did was on mobility disability. So again, this is a good kind of test case, not just because it's a very common disability, but also it's one that can be either congenital or acquired. So, for congenital, you've got examples of people with cerebral palsy and spina bifida. And for acquired, you might have spinal cord injury or a variety of other things. We wanted to focus on people with relatively stable conditions because we recognize that conditions that progress or conditions that are episodic involve constant adaptation, right? And that is an interesting and other story that we can kind of layer on top of this.
Yeah.
But we were interested first in what if we just look at stable conditions? And so in that situation, we did find kind of a replication of what we found in the facial paralysis work, that those with congenital conditions seem to be faring better. And what we looked at was satisfaction with life in general. And we found that those with congenital conditions had higher satisfaction with life, and that was actually mediated or correlated with, these are the mechanisms we think might be happening. And that is what I call disability self-concept. So this includes disability identity, feeling that your disability is an important part of you and that it's a positive thing. And that also includes disability self-efficacy. And that means that you are confident that you can navigate your world and navigate challenges that come up regarding your disability. So that's really like confidence in your adaptiveness. And so those things were higher in people with congenital conditions. And so, we suspect what's going on is that when people go through their initial development naturally, learning how to navigate the world and interact with people alongside their disability, people, can develop these adaptations very fluidly. And of course, as you say, sometimes acquiring a disability includes trauma. It also includes for everybody the experience of having a changed identity and a change in function. And many people are really good at adapting and bouncing back. But we do contend that perhaps there's a bit of an advantage if you go through it in a certain critical period of time early in life.
So, oh, wow. So if you have something happen, let's say before the age of 25 or the age of 30, is that what you're thinking? Or what did you figure out what that critical time of life was?
No, that's $1 million question for sure. But, what we really need are some really cool, large-scale longitudinal studies to know if that's, really a thing or not. But, I think what we're suspecting is that it's like a critical period, probably early in life, maybe before 5 or 10 or something like that. And it may depend on the disability. So, for example, there's already a large body of research on deaf people and their experience with deaf identity, with language acquisition. And we know that can mirror the critical period for language acquisition that's understood that all children have when it's relatively easy to learn other languages. So I think that's a nice model that we might explore.
Right. No, the deaf community is an interesting one because I know members of the deaf community who, for instance, they're my age, so they're not young, but they were brought up they were congenitally deaf and they were expected to learn how to lip read rather than to use sign. And at some level, they now sign, they do both, but they were deprived of communication at a critical stage in their lives. And what I find interesting is there's some families who continue not to have learned sign, that the expectation is that that person will engage with them via, normal channels, right? And deafness is as you were talking, when you brought it up, it was exactly what I was thinking of in terms of longitudinal studies. And it's also one of the things I was thinking about, we were talking to another individual about disabilities, sort of a historian and writer, is about aging with disability. And so, there are certain disabilities that are harder to age with than others. And I think mobility impairments are one of them that become quite difficult because you're using your bodies in ways in which wasn't designed. For instance, using your shoulders and arms, whereas if you're using a manual chair or using crutches, that, they are great for a while, but after a while they're not so great. They hurt, right? And, you get a lot of, but being deaf, I don't think changes that much. Fundamentally, you might get more deafness, but in essence, if you use sign and you've already developed your adaptations, you're not likely to have change those very much. So at some level, it's stable, that stability of a disability. I always find it it's only the second time, but I find it absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Your grad students and your students must love listening to you and listening to the work you're doing. If you had what do you want to be doing? What are you doing now? What do you want to be doing in the future? Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I love talking with my students and grad students too. It's like the best part of my job. And really, my answer to you is kind of whatever my grad students are doing. So I've been very intentional recently to bring on grad students with interest in intersectionality, which I think is really underrepresented in at least my neck of the woods,
Right.
disability psychology research. We're doing a lot of stuff around how having, at least one other stigmatized identity along with disability, it's not just an additive stigma, it's an interactive stigma. It creates something new and different that really hasn't been examined much yet.
Right.
And so, like, one example of a project that my student Marissa Crowder is working on, she's interested in visible disability. A lot of our work lately is on what we call observable or visible disabilities. And her work has been around how people of color and people and white people kind of experience differences in how people react to their observable disability. And so some of her early work is showing that one way people cope with experiencing discrimination is to move towards your in-group, right? So if you experience discrimination and you attribute it to racism, well, you might go spend time, get some solidarity with your Black friends.
Right.
If you experience discrimination and attribute it to your disability, you may go spend some time with your disabled friends and be like, wasn't that BS, and stuff like that. But if you have both identities or more, it's really hard to make an attribution about what the discrimination was for. Was it because you're Black? Was it because you're disabled? Was it because of both? Or something else altogether? And what we find is that people of color seem to feel less comfortable moving to disabled spaces to cope than they do with moving to spaces with their own racial or ethnic group to cope. But if they go to that racial or ethnic group to cope, they feel that they're leaving out their disability identity.
Right.
So there's not these opportunities in groups to really kind of have both represented.
I mean, as you say that, one of the things that I was thinking about that I think particularly in the US, the experience of being Black is different than, let's say, being Black in, let's say, France, or being Black in Africa and being disabled, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, they're going to be different. There's racism everywhere, but I do think that there is a character to American racism that has been deeply sort of structured by the slavery that was across the continent. I mean, in South America, the same. I've been thinking about intersectionality as well, but one of the things I'm interested in is that I do think it's hard to know why you feel discriminated against. I mean, as a woman, right? If you're a disabled woman, I think there's one of the things that I used to think about. I happen to be gay as well, and I don't know. It's not really clear to me. I think you just wander through the world. For me, the identity I was really slow to take up the identity of disability, even though I was in a wheelchair, used a wheelchair for 15 years. Could not use, I had to, right? And now I have choices. But the thing that I found is that I didn't identify as a disability until finally, it just sort of punched me in the face that everybody else saw me as disabled. And if I didn't take a hold of this, it was the same thing around being gay. I didn't wake up every morning and sort of think, oh, I'm a lesbian. Isn't that, I just carried out my life, but everybody else saw me as a lesbian. And so therefore I kind of had to manipulate, I had to grapple with it. And that was my experience. I think for some people, they embrace disability pride far more easily, far more readily than I did. I'm wondering whether you find that as part of this sort of, how you find that an identity about how people identify in all of this.
Yeah, for sure. So what you're talking about is kind of identity centrality, like whether you see this as like, kind of the primary thing about you. And it's pretty rare in disability. And also, side note, I very much relate to what you were saying. Even though I was born with my disability, I didn't know that it was considered a disability. And then further, once I knew, I still didn't want to identify for a while. And so I didn't really identify and kind of start to do disability related research until my mid-20s. And so it's 25 years with my disability without that identity.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of things going on there. I think a lot of it has to do with stigma, fear of discrimination. I also think it has to do with, how just how central is your disability to your life? Mine is quite central now because I'm a disability researcher, right? But some people, I think, can have a neutral or positive view of their disability, but it's also just not very central to, their everyday life, their career, their relationships, and things like that. And that's great too.
No, I think it's great too. And I think in part that reflected I didn't want it to be central to my life. I wanted it to be sort of a part of me, but not the part of me, right? And I know I'm aware that time is running out. Just, quickly, what would you advise a young person who, let's say, either has Moebius syndrome or another disability? What would you advise, knowing what you know now about having lived with this, but also doing the research that you do particularly?
Yeah, I mean, I would advise, going back to what we were saying, that we have so much capacity for adaptation and for creativity. And I will also emphasize how beneficial it can be to connect with community. So maybe that's other people with your specific condition, or maybe you have a really rare condition. It's not possible for you to connect with someone locally. But there are plenty of ways to do that online now. But also, there are plenty of commonalities, across conditions. You don't need to find someone with your particular condition. But that shared experience of moving through the world differently and having to be a creative adapter can be really neat when finding solidarity with others. So that's what I'll leave you with.
What an excellent conversation. It was awesome to hear Dr. Bogart's academic experiences and how she persevered to create more inclusive spaces in an area that didn't formally include her. It was also so interesting to hear her thoughts on disability identity, how a person can possess a disability but still not identify as disabled. This reminds me about the HIV/AIDS sex campaign that Chloe often speaks about.
Yeah, you've probably heard that story one too many times, but it's an interesting one about identity and communication. During the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s, public health professionals wanted to encourage safe sex practices among gay men, as the virus was spreading through sexual contact and was ravaging the homosexual community. They posted flyers in the San Francisco public transit system, but actually saw no drop in HIV numbers. Things changed when they rewrote their flyers. Instead of wording the title as, "If you're gay, you should use condoms," they altered it to say, "If you're a man having sex with men, you should use condoms." The clinicians and social workers initially didn't understand that not everyone who was male and having sex with other males saw themselves as gay. They originally didn't read the posters because, as far as they were concerned, they weren't addressing them. And anyway, infection rates began to fall once people grasped the fact that identity is far more nuanced than they realized. People self-identify in ways that may not reflect the manner in which others perceive them. Actually, when we listened to Kathleen Bogart, I realized that I had very much a similar story of identity and disability. I didn't immediately identify as disabled, nor did I really want to be a member of the disabled community. That's, of course, changed, but it changed as my understanding of my identity changed across time.
This episode of Broadcastability was hosted by Chloe Atkins, a professor at the University of Toronto and an anti-ableist researcher. and Lark Huska, an undergraduate researcher at the University of Toronto and communications officer for the Proud Project. This episode was also edited by Lark Huska. Isabel Abakumovich-Poynton created the artwork, and Justin Laurie composed the music. Broadcastability can be found on Apple Music and Spotify, and at broadcastability.ca. Broadcastability is a Proud Project production based in Toronto, Canada. Visit theproudproject.ca to learn more.